Now to New Brunswick, and a push to remove Premier Blaine Higgs as provincial Conservative leader. A majority of riding association presidents want a leadership review. This follows pushback on changes to the province's Policy 713 on LGBTQ students, and Dorothy Shepherd quitting cabinet last week over the Premier's leadership style. Let's bring in Dominic Cardy, who resigned from the Higgs government last autumn. He's now an independent MLA. Mr. Cardy, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate the chance to chat.
All right, so what is your view on this grassroots challenge to the Premier from within the Progressive Conservative Party?
Well, it's been brewing for a while. There have been concerns over the Premier's increasingly autocratic style, the way in which caucus has been completely sidelined, cabinet often not consulted on important decisions. I can say that without breaking cabinet confidence, but last year we saw our elected health boards being abolished without any discussion with cabinet at all. So I can talk about things that didn't get discussed at cabinet. That was one of a long list of efforts that the Premier has made to centralize power in his office. He has hired and fired senior civil servants. He's now started hiring and firing mid-level senior servants. Totally inappropriate. So there's been that consolidation of power, coupled with, over the last year, an increasingly difficult style with just in the way he engages people personally, and more worryingly recently, a real abandonment of the Progressive Conservative Party's constitution and values as he started to move quite quickly towards a more American Republican-style right-wing populism, which goes totally against the platform he was elected on in both 2018 and 2020, and I think is really causing concern to a lot of progressive conservatives in New Brunswick that we feel a little bit like it's 2015, and in the American Republican Party, we can see Donald Trump walking down those staircases, the golden escalator, and realizing now that it's our responsibility to make sure that the sort of horrors that we've seen in that party aren't repeated here in the east coast of Canada.
You wrote a letter of your own when you resigned as Education Minister, similar to Dorothy Shepherd's letter from 2021. You said the Premier was a micromanager taking a wrecking ball to French immersion, for instance. And now we do have this letter that Dorothy Shepherd, who resigned from Cabinet, has released on what her experience was in 2021 about the Premier's leadership style. What's your thoughts in reading what she had to say?
Well, I had a really good experience working with now former Minister Shepherd when I was Education Minister. She's incredibly hardworking, caring, and just puts everything she has into the job. And I know that letter that she drafted back in 2021 was hard for her to write then, and she was very disappointed that the Premier didn't even respond to it, and she wasn't able to talk about the letter with him for several months. But she raises the same concerns that I did around a year later, and are now the same concerns we're hearing expressed by grassroots party leaders. So there's a tendency towards autocracy and consolidating power in his office. That is not hugely unusual, sadly. It's why we have democracy. There's a tendency for leaders to try and consolidate power. It's why we need to have political parties and elected officials having the courage of their convictions to be able to push back against that sort of centralizing direction, especially with a Premier who was elected on a promise of depoliticizing and decentralizing government. To see him now abandoning data and evidence in favor of an ideological-driven push to the hard right is really unfortunate, and again, really goes against the values of the Progressive Conservative Party that I'm still happy as a member of that party to support and uphold. Whether it's been attacks on French immersion, First Nations, across the board, there's been a real effort to undermine the independence of the civil service, and those trends are ones that we've seen in other countries lead to really disastrous results for the people in those countries. So why we would want to go down that road, I just don't know. And this most recent effort to target a tiny number of kids who might identify as trans in our school system, and to wrap this up in, again, a sort of a culture war package around parents' rights, it's sad, it's not true, and it's creating real division and harm for kids in our province and for our political system as a whole.
Okay, and the Premier has argued that in terms of Policy 713, that he's speaking for parents, that it takes resolve to handle tough issues, that caucus isn't always unanimous on these issues, but going forward, how do you think those arguments are going to play within the Progressive Conservative Party as a whole in New Brunswick? How precarious do you think his position is as Premier and as leader?
It's up to the party council to decide. They're meeting on Saturday. The leadership review won't be on the agenda there because it's 21 days notice period once the letters are collected before something can be put on the agenda. But clearly there's going to be discussion around his leadership. And it'll be up to the caucus to either decide they want to choose someone else to represent the majority party in the legislature, which they can do at any time, and decide that the premier is no longer premier. And he needs to be reminded of that we have hundreds of years of democratic tradition that have put safeguards in place against people trying to seize absolute power in a party. And referring back to 713, the irony here is that Policy 713 was signed when I signed it when I was education minister, the original version. It was fully discussed at caucus. There was a rollout that resulted in precisely 0 complaints over 2.5 years. The premier is absolutely now getting some folks, most of them not from New Brunswick, but engaging in online rage farming. He's getting a lot of attention from folks who supported the Freedom Convoy, anti-vaxxers, other conspiracy theorists, but also from parents who are legitimately concerned when he talks about parents' rights being eroded. But it's just not true. The way I sum up the issue is that, is it true that parents should be involved in every single aspect of their child's lives at school? And the answer to that is yes. Second question, are there some kids who are going to be put at potential risk of harm or even death if parents are involved in discussing their gender identity? And the answer to that is yes. And so if you talk about a serious issue, it's not the premier's rage farming and sliding off to an extreme to try and get clicks from American ultra-right wingers. Really grappling a tough issue is taking the answers to those two questions and trying to figure out how you come up with a compromise that protects kids and parents' rights at the same time, and not engaging in the hysteria that the premier has intentionally been stoking up because he sees it as being one of his only hopes of being able to maintain his position as premier. And I think it's a real abuse of that issue. He's putting the lives and health and safety of people at risk in our province, and he's creating utterly needless division around a sensitive and complicated issue. Trying to reduce anything that's tough and difficult down to a soundbite is nearly always going to lead to bad government. Unfortunately, the premier is becoming expert in that, if not in very much else.
All right, Dominic Cardy, independent MLA in New Brunswick. We have to leave it there, but thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. Take care.